and welcome to the Cardinal News of Virginia, a podcast from Cardinal News. We're a nonprofit news outlet. We cover Southwest and Southside Virginia without paywalls, and we are at cardinalnews.org. I'm Dutchie Jessee, and I want to give a thanks to our sponsor for the podcast, and that is 5 Points Creative, a full-service, award-winning marketing firm serving clients all over the U.S. from their headquarters in Roanoke, Virginia. I am joined today by Grace Mamon, who covers Danville for us at Cardinal News. Hi, Grace.
Hi, how are you, Dutchie?
I'm great. Thank you so much for sitting down today for the podcast. And what we're going to talk about today is data centers, which is a hot topic in Virginia right now. And I know you've covered your fair share of news on that front in our Cardinal coverage area. So I thought what we could start with is to define it. Now, I have to say, when I started reading about data centers, and it was more and more in the news in Virginia over the last months or year, I thought of a job I had in college, and this would have been the early 90s, and it was a postal data processing center. Fiber optics were new back then, and we entered zip codes, basically, is what we did on computers for mail that wasn't being read otherwise, and it came through on fiber optics, and that was a data processing center. Are data centers the same thing as data processing centers?
They're a little bit different. They're really large scale projects, large scale facilities. So they basically look from the outside like a big warehouse, and inside is just full of servers that store and transmit data. So yeah, they do some transmission like you were talking about. Usually they're owned by companies like Amazon or Google, Microsoft, like big tech companies that need that space to store and send their data. Individuals also, like you and I, contribute to the demand as well, just by using the internet, social media, streaming stuff. We're part of that demand as well, but most of it is generated from these large companies, particularly through the use of AI. But they are pretty unfamiliar projects down here in Southside, although other places in Virginia are much more familiar with them. So it's been kind of a new thing for us down here.
All right. So the processing center I had in mind from long ago was more about people processing the data using the technology. And this is more about housing computers and servers to process data that way, right?
Yes, and you're right. It does take much less people now, and there are usually very few employees at a data center. It provides a lot of construction jobs, and there's a lot to get it up and running. But once it's going, it pretty much just runs on its own, and there's some maintenance needed here and there, and some janitorial work needed, but it really doesn't employ a lot of people. So what you were doing was probably much more hands-on.
Yeah. So let's get to where we are in Virginia now. We know that Northern Virginia has a lot of data centers. Can you tell us more about that? And then we'll get into what they say about having the data centers later. But tell us where they are in Virginia right now. Are they all in Northern Virginia? What's the deal?
They're almost exclusively in Northern Virginia. And something I didn't know before starting to research data centers was that Northern Virginia has more data centers than anywhere else in the world. It's like 35% of the world's data centers are in Northern Virginia, almost entirely Loudoun County. So Prince William is kind of getting some data center projects up and running. They really have a lot in the pipeline, but Loudoun has the most operational right now. And I think it's like something like 50 million square feet of data center space in Loudoun County is operational. There are a few exceptions. I know there's some in Lynchburg, some in Roanoke, and there's one in Mecklenburg County, which is the closest one down here near us in Danville. But there have not been any in Danville or Pittsylvania County, although Pittsylvania County has just this past year seen its first 2 data center proposals ever. So they are starting to kind of move out of Northern Virginia to Southside. And the reason for that, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. That's what I was going to say is why? Yes. Are they just running out of space up there in Northern Virginia physically?
Essentially, yes. Data centers are big projects, so they take a lot of space. And Loudoun County and Prince William are kind of tapped out of space, honestly, physical space. And then also the energy grid is pretty tapped out as well. They're actually straining the electric grid because of how much energy these data centers use. So recent projects up there have had to add new transmission lines. They've had to build transmission lines to get to these projects. So it really is just kind of almost full up basically up there. And so data center developers are now looking to other places in Virginia where, sites that might be conducive to data centers.
Okay, so Pittsylvania County, which is part of the of Cardinal's coverage area, and yours in particular, because you cover our Danville region. What's going on with proposed data centers there, and why Pittsylvania County in particular, just besides the fact that it's not Northern Virginia?
Yeah, good question. So there have been 2 data center proposals in Pittsylvania County in the past year. One was last summer, and that project was approved despite pretty considerable resident opposition. It's a piece of land off Highway 58, and the Board of Supervisors did approve it. So that, I don't know that construction has necessarily started yet, but they will be building that over the next 5-10 years. The second proposal came a little bit later in the fall, and that one has faced a little bit more trouble kind of moving through the process. Originally, it was a really large project. It was something like 2,200 acres. They wanted to build 80-some data center buildings and a 3,500 megawatt power plant, powered by the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which is why Pittsylvania County was attractive to the developers for this specific proposal. They want to create on-site power so that they don't have to use as much electricity, and they wanted the pipeline to power that. So they were looking at an area of Pittsylvania County near Chatham, kind of in the center of the county, and that has faced quite a bit of resident opposition. People live out there, and they enjoy the beautiful views of the country and the farmland, and there's a lot of back roads that really aren't conducive to heavy traffic. So kind of a whole host of concerns, and that one has faced a little bit more trouble moving through. So they did scale back the project to about a third of the size, maybe, with many less buildings, although they do still want to build the power plant. And where we are now is that project, that scaled back version, has been recommended for denial by the County Planning Commission, and it is scheduled to go to the Board of Supervisors for a final vote in March. The meeting was actually supposed to be tomorrow, but they have pushed it back yet again. So it will be in March. And a lot of people are waiting on that decision and really, really invested in the outcome.
What is it? You mentioned a few things, the back roads that really weren't built for a lot of traffic in this kind of industry. Obviously, for a new data center to come in, local governing bodies like planning commissions, and then on to county supervisors, city council governments, those types of things have to approve it. I'm assuming there's zoning issues. So is that in this particular case in Chatham, is that a rezoning issue that has to happen first?
Yes, so the vote that's up in March, the item that the Board of Supervisors will be considering is a rezoning application. So right now the land is zoned for agricultural use, I believe, and they need it rezoned to heavy industrial use, which is quite a big change. And then there's going to be some special permitting, alongside that in order to actually build the data center if the rezoning is approved. But that's what's on the table right now.
Are people looking at this particular example, Danville, Grace, to your knowledge, as an example, and have any of the opponents to it said, once we do this, we're opening the door to more of this, and we don't want it? We'll get into why they don't want it in more details about that. But is that part of the thing that people are afraid of, is just that this sets a precedent?
Yes, absolutely. Especially because data center demand is not going away, and Southside is or Southwest is kind of the new target for a lot of these developers. I think people are afraid that more are coming anyway. And so if this one is approved, then it kind of lets developers know that Pittsylvania County is interested in these types of projects. Especially this project specifically, because it was scaled down. I think a lot of people are concerned that if the scaled down version is approved, the developers will then want to expand it again back to its original size, which they have expressed interest in doing. So I think that's a valid concern. Yeah, and a lot of people just think that this type of development does not really fit in agricultural residential areas.
Yeah, we have a more rural region, the Cardinal's coverage area, which is Southwest and Southside Virginia. Lots of suburbs, some cities, not super large cities. So we're very different from Northern Virginia, and the whole lifestyle or culture could be different there, just because of the nature of Northern Virginia and being sort of a high-tech hub for so long now. And it's just outside of DC, so you've got that as well. I want to talk more about what you've heard about Northern Virginia. since it has more data centers than anywhere on the planet, which did you say the planet or
Yeah.
like just the country? Yeah,
The
I mean, that's
planet, which is
crazy.
hard to believe. Yeah.
That's crazy. So what have you heard from them about, because they've been there for a long time? What are the pros and cons? Pros, you can guess, they're economic, right?
Yeah.
But what are some of the things people say up there about, hey, watch out, this is what happens when you have a data center? Tell me about that.
Yeah, I have learned so much from people up in Northern Virginia. I went up to Prince William County in January and I spoke to some residents up there who are very vocal opponents of the data center industry spread. And I've also spoken to some elected officials in Loudoun and Prince William. And one thing that keeps coming up is land use. So make sure that these projects are correctly located, correctly zoned. They really don't belong near residential neighborhoods, is what I've been hearing. And up in Northern Virginia, I mean, they're everywhere. Like I drove through neighborhoods where they're 200 feet behind someone's home is a data center building, and they're next to public schools, they're next to retirement communities. There's a large one planned, and it's kind of tied up in lawsuits right now, but it's planned to go right between the Manassas National Battlefield and a state forest. So a lot of people up in Northern Virginia are really unhappy with where these projects have been located. And a lot of that was not being proactive about zoning in Loudoun, especially. I know that for a long time, data centers were by right, which means they did not need to go before the Board of Supervisors for any sort of stamp of approval. They could just go where there was any industrial zoned area. So that could be like an office building area. It could have been light industry, medium, heavy industry. So they just kind of sprung up everywhere, and there wasn't proper zoning in place to contain them. So that's the biggest piece of advice I've heard from elected officials up in Northern Virginia, is to really tighten up your zoning before you approve even one data center. Again, because like you mentioned, setting a precedent for where they could be located.
So what is it about the data center? What kind of neighbor is a data center in
Yeah.
your everyday experience in your house? Tell us about that.
Yeah, great question. So obviously, while they're being built, I think construction, traffic, and noise is a big nuisance to people. I talked to some folks who live near an Amazon data center up in Prince William, and even after it's been built, it's exceptionally loud. There are cooling fans that run all the time to cool the servers, because they get very hot. So the people inside their homes in this neighborhood can hear the noise, which is 24/7 noise. They kind of described it as like a low rumble. So it's not that it's super, high pitched or loud or anything, but it's constant. It's 24/7. So that is unpleasant for a lot of people. Also, a big complaint that I've heard is just view sheds. They're usually pretty ugly buildings, which nobody wants to live next to, especially down here, in more rural Virginia, where people really chose to be here because of what it looks like. So view sheds are a huge complaint, which is, kind of more superficial. It's, aesthetics, but that's valid for a lot of people.
Did you go in anyone's house who lives near a data center? Were you able to experience it?
I did. Yeah, I did. And the man whose home I was in, the reason I was there is because he had some damage to his home because of construction. So when they were blasting for construction, his home was affected. He has cracks in his drywall and the foundation of his home. And a lot of these things, because they're with such big companies, they're really hard to address. Like even the noise has been hard to address with Amazon because it's such a huge company. So he told me, his homeowner's insurance, has been in conversation with Amazon, but Amazon basically just said, like, this is not our problem, go to your insurance. So there's, I think, like transparency and communication issues on top of everything else.
Wow.
Yeah.
Basic question here, but why do we need data centers? So these developers and these companies that need the data centers would give a certain reason about, hey, this is just a fact of life today. We need the data centers and these buildings. Because where does the demand come from?
Yeah, good question. And that's kind of something I've been running into in my reporting, is like, no one really wants these around, or most of the people that I've talked to, they don't want these around. And yet the world is increasingly reliant on technology and on the internet. So they have to exist and they have to go somewhere. So kind of what do we do with that? The demand is coming from, like I said, an increasing reliance on technology, but recently, a lot of the big, exponential demand that we're seeing is coming from AI use. AI uses so much more energy than, you or I on Instagram or on YouTube. So a lot of the big AI products that are being pushed out from companies like Google it's creating much more demand for data centers. A lot of people think that's speculative demand, that AI isn't actually going to need as much as we think it is, and we're building all these data centers and they might not even be used. So there's a lot of conversation around that, but the short answer is that it's mostly increasing reliance on technology and AI.
What next? And I know we've got a vote or action coming up in the Chatham example coming up soon. Where else should we be looking in terms of where this issue of data centers needing to pop up, theoretically, and looking to pop up in other places other than Northern Virginia, because Northern Virginia, as you said, is just tapped out. Where else should we be keeping our eyes open right now?
Honestly, I think most of Southside and Southwest could be a target for some developers. Some localities want them, they're trying to attract them. I know in Southwest, elected officials have said, come to us with your data center proposals, like we'll consider them. And I think, I should probably talk about the economic benefit, because that is a huge factor in this. And that's the reason why a lot of localities even consider these projects, is that they can bring an enormous amount of tax revenue. So the project that was approved in Ringgold in Pittsylvania County, I think was over $1 billion, or maybe it was $120 million annually once it's up and built. So that I think that was the number. And the one in Chatham was more than that. So, counties can do a lot of stuff with tax revenue like that. They don't create as many jobs, so that's not a huge, pull economically. It's just really the tax revenue. And folks up in Northern Virginia have reaped the benefits of that, despite all the complaints. I know in Loudoun County, the average individual has had their annual taxes lowered by $3,000 a year because the county has brought in so much tax revenue from data centers. So I think some localities want that, and they have places where they could locate data centers that are away from neighborhoods and would not be disruptive. And that's really where they belong, is what a lot of the experts have told me. So if a county has an area like that, an industrial area where it wouldn't disturb anybody, I think there's no reason that it couldn't be a benefit to a locality.
Is there a reason we're talking about locating more in other parts of Virginia versus just other states? Or are the states dealing with this issue as much as we are?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I didn't know anything about this industry, so it's really been interesting to learn all about it. But apparently, the reason that Virginia is so popular for the data center industry is because partially because of the climate. So we have a pretty conducive climate to data centers. Like I mentioned, the servers get really hot. So if you were to locate a bunch of data centers in like the Southwest, somewhere where they would just overheat all the time, it would take so much water and so much energy to cool them down. That really just wouldn't be prudent. So Virginia apparently, number one, had the infrastructure, had the energy, there's a big pipeline running through the state. So I think energy and climate and kind of just access to other parts of the country, up and down the East Coast is a really big reason that Virginia is so popular.
You mentioned you didn't know a lot about this till you started covering it, which is one of the cool things about being a reporter, is you get to learn as you go. What has surprised you that you've already run into, Grace, that you think is something you would tell readers or people maybe who haven't read any coverage but they're hearing this podcast? What should they be paying attention to?
Oh, that's a good question. This is, I'll get to your question, but the thing I've been most surprised about is how interested I am in this. I didn't expect to just get like super into it, but it's really fascinating and it's so complex and there's so many layers. So anybody who's like starting to get into it, there's, so much more to learn. I still have so much more to learn. So it's just a really expansive topic that I wasn't expecting. But I would say for people who don't know too much about it, I think this affects everybody in Virginia. Even if you don't have a data center in your backyard, one way or another, I know in Northern Virginia, a lot of people who don't live near data centers are still paying for like the transmission line to a new data center to be built. That that cost is passed on to ratepayers. So, you know, if your utility bill goes up from Dominion, it might be because they're building a new transmission line to provide energy to a data center. So that's a big complaint that people have. I think, you know, you don't have to be right next to one of these things to be affected by it. So we're going to start seeing that more and more, I think, in Southwest and Southside Virginia. So it'll be interesting to kind of follow this, you know, the spread of this industry and see where it goes and see how much they can actually, you know, how much success they actually have in Southwest and Southside. I think that will be really interesting. But I don't know. I'm biased. I think it's fascinating. So I think people should look into it. It's really interesting. It's really complex.
Well, and you raise a great point about that, Grace. I mean, just the phrase data centers, the visuals aren't real compelling. It sounds dry, but you're right. In just this conversation with you, you hear there's a lot more to this than you might think, which is the whole reason to stay, you know, up to date with news as much as you can. And your coverage is super helpful. And this conversation has been gratifying, and we'll keep covering it because this isn't going anywhere anytime soon, not only in the beat that you have, which is in Southside Virginia, but throughout Cardinal's coverage area in Southwest and Southside Virginia. So Grace Mamon, our Danville reporter with Cardinal, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dutchie.
All right. Well, thank you for listening to the Cardinal News of Virginia, a podcast from Cardinal News. We're nonprofit at cardinalnews.org. And thanks to our sponsor, 5 Points Creative, and to our own Zachary Shelton for technical support. I'm Dutchie Jessee for Cardinal News.